In this lesson, we're going to add some logging to our Web API calls. The objectives for this lesson are to learn why we log, the different log libraries that are available, the commonalities between these libraries, where we can log to, controlling log levels, and logging to a file using the Serilog library. So why do we log? We track users when they do things, we track exceptions, we maybe want to help troubleshoot our performance issues or other problems in our code. These are some of the reasons why we want to employ logging. Now, there's a lot of logging libraries out there. Most of them are based on the Microsoft.extensions.logging namespace. It provides the interface that the other libraries then follow. And different libraries or packages that are out there that you can use are like nlog, Serilog, log4net. As I mentioned, they all have a common interface, so all logging libraries follow the same basic interface. They have common methods used to log items, such as log, log critical, log debug, log error, log information, and log warning. So where can you put the log information? Well, most logging libraries will allow you to log to the console window, to the debug window, to the event log if you're on Windows, to a trace that you set up, to a file, even to a table, although I probably wouldn't use that one too much. And you can log to email as well. And of course, there's probably others out there I've forgotten. Now, the way we use logging is we inject an instance of ILogger and then whatever your controller name is, or class name if you're going into a class. So you set up a private read-only, I call it _logger, and then you have in your constructor where it's going to be injected into. So let's take a look at our first demo here of logging messages. Right mouse click on the controllers folder and let's add a class, and we'll call it log test controller. And into this, we're going to build another controller like we've usually done, where we have our route attribute, our API controller attribute, our class name, which in this case is log test controller, and it inherits from controller base. Now I'm going to create a private read-only field called _logger. It's of the type ILogger. Now ILogger is built into ASP.NET. You simply pass in the name of the class into which you're using this particular ILogger object, and dependency injection will then inject it through the constructor here. Now let's create a method that we can just log a bunch of messages, and we're going to try out all the different little methods here like log trace, log debug, log information, etc. And then of course we need an action method that will call that private method. So we'll do an HTTP GET. We'll do the route. We'll call it write messages. I've got a public string that's called write messages, and it will call that write log messages method. And then it'll just simply return, check the console window, because the logger by default is just going to log to the console. That's the one that's built in, and it comes with ASP.NET. Let's run this. And we should now see our new log test here. We'll click on that write messages route. We'll execute. It says to check the console window. We'll come over here and we'll take a look. So right here, you can see the info. AdventureWorks API.controllers.log test controller. This is an information log entry. Then we have, this is a warning log entry. This is an error log entry. And then we have the exception object. And then we have a critical log entry. So this is what they look like, the default out of the box logging to the console. Now, each of those methods that I was calling, I called them in a specific order, and they correspond to what's called the logging levels. So logging is broken into levels, and it starts at 0 trace. These are all enumerations, by the way. Debug equals 1, information equals 2, warning equals 3, error equals 4, and critical equals 5, and then none is 6. Now, we can control that log level. We configure the log level in app settings. The default is information. If you remember, we had a trace and a debug call in our write log messages method, but those didn't show up in the console window. And that's because it looked at the default here and said, I'm only going to record things that are information and higher in that log level. So the trace and the debug messages, even though I called them, they were not logged because it respected this level in the appsettings.development.json file. So let's take a look at how we change this default logged level. Expand the appsettings.json to locate appsettings.development.json, and you can see the default here is information. If we change this to trace, now we will get the log trace and the log debug showing up in our console window as well, because before it said start at information and get everything higher than that. So that would have been log information, log warning, log error, and log critical. Let's go ahead and run this now. Let's try this again. Okay, and then we will come over to our console window, and now you can see the trace, the debug, and these are the ones that I wrote, the info, the warning, the fail, which is the error, and the critical. So just by changing that level in our JSON file, we can see and get different effects of what we want to log in our logging system. Another option here is we could actually also set this to none. And if we set it to none, it's going to do exactly what you think, because that's the highest level. So none of the other ones below it will actually be executed. So we get nothing. All right, let's go ahead and set that back though to either trace or information, whatever you want to put it back to. I'm going to go ahead and just set it back to the default. Now, sometimes when we're working in our program, we have a class and it has some data in it, and we'd like to be able to log that. So in order to log an object, we have to serialize it first to a JSON string. And we can use the JSON serializer from the system.text.json namespace. So if we create a product object and we set some properties in there, you would do string JSON equals JSON serializer.serialize on that entity, and it will give us back a string representation of that product object. And from there, we can then log that object. Let's go back to our log test controller, and let's add a new method here, log product. So we'll create an object called product entity, and we set some values in there, $9.99, a test product, things like that. And then on line 54, string JSON equals JSON serializer.serialize product, passing in the entity. That gives us that data back as a string. We can now do an underscore logger.log information, product equals, and then we use a replaceable parameter, JSON, and then a comma, and then we put JSON, and that will take that string value and place it into that parameter there. So now all we need to do is add an action method to be able to call this log product. So there we go. We'll create a new HTTP GET. The route is log object. We've got a public string log object, and then we call that log product. So let's go ahead and run this. Execute that. Go over and find our console window, and there you see that product object. Let's now take a look at logging to a text file. Now, as I mentioned, we can log to different storage locations. I'm going to tell you right now, logging to a database is not recommended. If you have just a small little site and you don't have a lot of usage, you're probably okay. But a database is not very fast, so you don't want to slow your application down just to handle logging. Use an in-memory queue instead, and then maybe use a task or a Windows service to move that data to SQL Server. But let's take a look at logging to a text file. And one of the things I'd recommend is don't write it yourself. There's lots of tools out there that will actually truncate after the file reaches a certain size, or it might create a new log file every day. We want to do something like that. You don't want your log file to just get huge after, lots and lots of time and you forget to go and clean it out. So let's take a look at logging to a text file. Let's right mouse click on the AdventureWorks API project and let's do Manage, NuGet Packages. We'll go to Browse. We'll type in Serilog.ASP.NET Core. So locate that one and install this. Go ahead and accept. And then the other one we want to install is the syncs.file. We call it a log sync. So where it's going to store to. This one happens to go to a file. And you can see below it that there's some other syncs that you can use, a rolling file, a syncs.email, there's a rolling file alternate, there's an archive, there's a gzip, lots of different things you can do here. But let's go ahead and install this one now. So now that we have those, how do we use these things? Well, we're going to go into our program.cs, and I'm going to add a using statement. Use Serilog, and I'm going to move all these up above there, like so. And then we're going to use this Serilog by configuring it. So I'm going to, after I've created my objects here, I'm going to go ahead and do a builder.host.use Serilog, passing in the context and this LC. So the LC is the logging context, and we're going to log write to console, do our logging context.write2.file. Now the file, it says, well, I want to put it into a logs folder, and we'll do a pattern of log dash something. And after the dash, they'll actually put in the date and time for us, which is kind of neat. And then they've got this other parameter called rolling interval. Well, we want to do a rolling interval of a day. So every day it will create a new file. Now that means that I've got to come over here, right mouse click on my project, and I have to add a new folder called logs to give it that place to store. The other thing I think I'll do is I'll come in here and I'll change my message a little bit to say, check the console window or log file. So we'll change it there, we'll change it there. Let's now go ahead and run this. So now Serilog has taken over the logging from the built-in one of ASP.NET. So when we run these now, it's still going to go to our console. So if we go over here and we check our console window, it looks a little different. Serilog actually puts the time on there. They say info, warn, error. So things are a little different. So each system that you use, each package that you bring in and use might do things a little bit differently, but the net result's the same. So not only do we get this information now in the console window like this, if we go check our log file, there's the same information there. And it actually tracks a lot of things from ASP.NET as well as our information. And there are ways to configure that so you can eliminate certain messages and not get everything. If we were to go ahead and run this again, and we'll click on the log object, there we go, come back out of here. Okay, you can now see that it added on more stuff. And down here on line 41, you can see our product, and there's all the data. In this lesson, we talked about the most common logging libraries and the common logging interfaces. We saw how we can control the log level through configuration settings. We saw how to serialize an object for logging, and we used Serilog to log to a text file. Coming up next, add exception handling to Web API calls.